Coffee splashes onto a woman's face. A threatening note appears in a ransacked home. Protesters gather outside a police station. These aren't random events. They're calculated moves in a dangerous game of power and corruption. In the next minutes, you'll see how these seemingly disconnected incidents weave together to tell a story of courage, integrity, and the high stakes of fighting for justice in a broken system. Lily Moore took a deep breath as she approached the police station, her heart pounding beneath her carefully chosen civilian attire. The weight of her concealed badge felt heavy against her chest, a reminder of the responsibility she carried. As she pushed open the glass doors, the bustling noise of the precinct washed over her. Officer Jake Turner glanced up from his desk, his eyes scanning Lily with disinterest. She approached, her steps measured and deliberate. "Excuse me, officer. I'd like to file a report for a theft," Lily said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Jake leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "A theft, huh? What did you lose, lady? Your cat?" His tone dripped with contempt, eliciting a few chuckles from nearby officers. Lily stood her ground, meeting Jake's dismissive gaze. "Actually, my wallet was stolen. It may seem minor to you, but it's important to me." She watched as Jake's expression hardened, his initial amusement morphing into irritation. "Look, we've got real crimes to deal with here. Why don't you go home and check under your couch cushions?" Jake's voice rose, drawing attention from other officers who began to watch the exchange with growing interest. Lily felt the tension in the room thicken, but she pressed on. "I understand you're busy, but it's my right to file a report. I'd appreciate it if you could assist me or direct me to someone who can." Jake's chair screeched against the floor as he abruptly stood, looming over Lily. "Listen here, you don't get to come in here and tell me how to do my job. I said we're busy, so take a hint and get out." The silence in the station was palpable now, other officers shifting uncomfortably but remaining silent. Lily could feel their eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in their gazes. "Officer Turner," Lily began, her voice calm but firm, "I'm not leaving until I've filed my report. It's your duty to serve and protect, and that includes taking reports from citizens, regardless of how minor you may think they are." Jake's face contorted with rage, his complexion reddening. In a swift, shocking motion, he grabbed his coffee cup and flung its contents directly at Lily's face. The scalding liquid splashed across her skin, eliciting a collective gasp from the onlookers. Lily stumbled back, her hand instinctively reaching for her face. The pain was intense, but she fought to maintain her composure. Through the burning sensation, she locked eyes with Jake, whose expression had shifted from anger to a mix of surprise and dawning horror at his own actions. Straightening her posture, Lily wiped her face with the back of her hand. The room had fallen completely silent, the tension now thick enough to cut with a knife. She took a moment to survey the shocked faces around her, noting the mix of disbelief and shame etched on many of them. "This isn't over," Lily said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the station, her steps measured and deliberate. As the door closed behind her, Lily allowed herself a small, grim smile. She had come seeking to observe the system, and in one brutal moment, its flaws had been laid bare before her. The scalding coffee on her skin was a stark reminder of the challenge that lay ahead, but it only strengthened her resolve. Change was coming to this precinct, whether they were ready for it or not. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with nervous energy. Officers shuffled into the meeting room exchanging worried glances. Little did they know, their world was about to be turned upside down. What would happen when they came face to face with the woman they had so callously dismissed? As the clock struck 9, the room fell silent. The door swung open, revealing a figure that made every officer's breath catch in their throat. Lily Moore strode in, her uniform crisp and her police chief badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes swept across the room, lingering for a moment on Jake Turner's stunned face. Lily took her place at the front of the room, her posture straight and confident. "Good morning, officers," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm sure you've all been eager to meet your new police chief. Well, here I am." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd as recognition dawned on their faces. She continued, her gaze unwavering. Some of you may remember me from yesterday. I came in as a civilian to file a theft report. The room grew impossibly quieter as the implications of her words sank in. I wanted to see firsthand how our officers interact with the public we're sworn to protect and serve. Lily's eyes found Jake Turner, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. His face had drained of color, the gravity of his actions from the previous day hitting him like a physical blow. Officer Turner, Lily addressed him directly, causing him to flinch. I believe you owe me a new shirt. Coffee stains are rather difficult to remove. The tension in the room was palpable. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared at the floor, unable to meet their new chief's eyes. Jake opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. What happened yesterday was unacceptable, Lily continued, her tone firm but not unkind. It's a symptom of a larger problem within this department, one that we're going to address head-on. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm here to implement changes, real lasting changes that will restore the trust between our department and the community we serve. Lily began to outline her plans for reform, starting with a comprehensive review of departmental policies and procedures. She emphasized the need for increased accountability, improved training on de-escalation techniques, and a zero-tolerance policy for abuse of power. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The initial shock and fear gave way to something else, a cautious hope. Some officers sat up straighter, their eyes lighting up with interest. Others nodded along, seemingly relieved that someone was finally addressing the issues they'd long known existed but felt powerless to change. Jake Turner, however, remained pale and silent, the full weight of his actions bearing down on him. He knew his days of unchecked authority were over, and the realization seemed to age him before everyone's eyes. As the meeting drew to a close, Lily's voice softened slightly. I know change can be difficult, she acknowledged, but I believe in this department, and I believe in each of you. Together, we can create a police force that truly serves and protects all members of our community. The room erupted into applause, hesitant at first but growing in strength. As the officers filed out, their expressions ranged from shocked to intrigued to openly supportive. Lily stood by the door, meeting each officer's eyes as they left. When Jake Turner approached, he paused, his shame evident in every line of his body. Chief, he began, but Lily held up a hand. We'll discuss your actions in private, Officer Turner, she said firmly. For now, I suggest you reflect on the kind of officer you want to be moving forward. As the last officer left the room, Lily took a deep breath. The first battle had been won, but the war for reform was just beginning. She squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Lily's words echoed through the precinct, another story was unfolding in the shadows. Behind a closed office door, Jake Turner sat motionless, his eyes fixed on relics of a different time. The gleaming service medals on his desk told a tale of two officers, the man he once was and the one he had become. Jake's gaze drifted to a faded photograph tucked into the corner of his desk. It showed a young man in a crisp uniform, eyes bright with promise and determination. He barely recognized himself in that eager smile. How long ago had that been? 10 years? 15? The memories washed over him, pulling him back to a time when the world seemed simpler, when right and wrong were clearly defined. Fresh out of the police academy, Jake had been the epitome of an idealistic young officer. He joined the force with dreams of making a difference, of protecting the innocent and bringing criminals to justice. His parents had beamed with pride at his graduation ceremony, his father's weathered hands gripping his shoulders tightly as he told Jake how proud he was. But those golden days were short-lived. Just 6 months into his career, Jake's world shattered. He'd been working a late shift when the call came in, a home invasion in progress. His heart had raced as he sped to the scene, lights flashing and sirens wailing. But he was too late. The image of his parents' lifeless bodies on the living room floor was seared into his memory, a nightmare that haunted him still. The investigation that followed was a cruel lesson in the imperfections of the justice system. Despite Jake's desperate pleas, the case went cold. Evidence was mishandled, witnesses recanted their statements, and eventually the file was tucked away in a dusty archive. forgotten by everyone except the grieving son left behind. Jake's faith in the system he'd sworn to uphold crumbled. The bright-eyed optimism that had once defined him gave way to a gnawing cynicism. He watched as criminals walked free on technicalities, as corrupt officers were protected by the thin blue line, as the innocent suffered while the guilty prospered. With each passing year, his disillusionment festered, warping his sense of right and wrong. Gradually, Jake began to see his badge not as a symbol of justice, but as a shield, a way to protect himself from the chaos of a world that had taken everything from him. He learned to bend rules, to look the other way when it suited him. Small compromises at first, but they grew larger with time. The power he wielded became intoxicating, a balm for the helplessness he'd felt on that fateful night. Jake's reputation within the department shifted. Some officers admired his results-oriented approach, while others whispered about his methods behind closed doors. But Jake didn't care. He had stopped believing in heroes long ago. In his mind, he was simply playing the game by the real rules, the ones that govern the streets, not the idealistic nonsense taught in the academy. As the years passed, Jake's influence grew. He cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and business owners. He accumulated favors and leverage, building a network that extended far beyond the confines of the precinct. His badge became more than a shield. It was a key that unlocked doors to power and influence he'd never dreamed possible. The memory faded, and Jake found himself back in the present, staring at his reflection in the polished surface of his desk. The eager young officer was long gone, replaced by a man hardened by tragedy and corrupted by power. As the echo of Lily Moore's words about reform and accountability rang in his ears, Jake's expression darkened. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let some idealistic newcomer tear it all down. Jake's jaw clenched as he made a decision. He would not go down without a fight. Let Chief Moore have her moment in the sun. He knew how to weather storms like her. In the end, Jake was certain the system would protect its own. It always had. While Jake believed the system would protect its own, he failed to notice the cracks forming in his carefully constructed world. One young officer was about to make a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire department. Chris Meyer stood in the break room, his coffee growing cold as he strained to hear the hushed conversation coming from the corner. Two senior officers, their heads bent close together, spoke in urgent whispers. Words like problem, more, and take care of it drifted across the room. Chris's stomach tightened. He'd only been on the force for 8 months, but he recognized a threat when he heard one. As he made his way back to his desk, Chris couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling over him. The precinct had been on edge ever since Chief Moore's dramatic reveal and subsequent announcement of sweeping reforms. Most officers seemed cautiously optimistic about the changes, but there was an undercurrent of resistance that Chris couldn't ignore. He glanced across the room at Jake Turner's office. The blinds were drawn, but Chris could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass. Jake had been closeted in there for hours, a steady stream of visitors coming and going. Chris had a sinking feeling that whatever was being planned in that office, it wasn't going to align with Chief Moore's vision for the department. Chris sat at his computer, his mind racing. He'd joined the force to make a difference, to protect and serve. But now he found himself at a crossroads. Should he speak up about his suspicions? The potential consequences made his palms sweat. He was still on probation, easily dismissed if he rocked the boat. And if Jake and his allies discovered Chris had ratted them out, well, he'd heard stories about what happened to officers who broke the code. But as Chris stared at his blank computer screen, he couldn't shake the image of Chief Moore standing tall in that meeting room, her eyes blazing with determination as she outlined her plans for reform. She was fighting for something bigger than any one person's career. Could he really stay silent and watch that dream get crushed before it had a chance to take root? With trembling fingers, Chris opened the department's case management system. He began methodically combing through recent reports, looking for discrepancies, altered statements, anything that seemed off. As the hours ticked by, a pattern began to emerge. Certain names kept popping up, charges mysteriously dropped, evidence misplaced. It was subtle, but to Chris's eyes, trained to spot even the smallest inconsistencies, it painted a damning picture. He was so engrossed in his search that he didn't notice Jake approaching until a shadow fell across his desk. Chris's heart leapt into his throat as he scrambled to minimize the windows on his screen. Working hard or hardly working, rookie? Jake's voice was friendly, but his eyes were sharp as they scanned Chris's workspace. Just, catching up on some paperwork, sir? Chris managed, hoping his voice didn't betray his panic. Jake nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Chris's computer. Good man, but don't work too late. We wouldn't want our newest officer burning out, would we? As Jake walked away, Chris let out a shaky breath. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't stop now. He had to see this through. Over the next few days, Chris gathered what evidence he could. He made copies of key documents, careful to cover his tracks. Every rustle of paper, every click of the copy machine sent his pulse racing. But finally, he had enough to make a case. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Chris slipped into Chief Moore's office while she was out at a community meeting. He placed an unmarked manila envelope on her desk, his fingers lingering for a moment on the smooth surface. Inside was everything he'd uncovered. The altered reports, the suspicious patterns, names and dates that pointed to a web of corruption far larger than he'd initially suspected. As Chris walked out of the office, his heart pounding in his ears, he knew there was no going back. He had chosen his side in this fight. Now all he could do was hope that it was the right one. While Chris grappled with his conscience across town, a clandestine meeting was taking place. What dark machinations were being set in motion, and how would they intersect with the young officer's newfound resolve? Jake Turner's footsteps echoed in the dimly lit parking garage as he approached a solitary figure, leaning against a sleek black sedan. Mark Calloway, the city's deputy mayor, straightened up as Jake drew near. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, adding an air of menace to their secretive rendezvous. This better be important, Turner, Calloway growled, his eyes darting around the empty garage. I'm risking a lot just being seen with you. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his usual confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy. It's Chief Moore. Her reforms. They're going to expose everything we've built. We need to act fast. Calloway's laugh was cold and mirthless. You're worried about some rookie, Chief? Relax, Turner. We've weathered worse storms than this. You don't understand, Jake insisted, his voice rising. She's not just talking about community outreach and sensitivity training. Moore's digging deep, internal audits, reviewing old cases. If she keeps pushing... Calloway held up a hand, silencing Jake mid-sentence. Let me remind you of something, officer. Our influence extends far beyond your little precinct. Judges, politicians, business leaders, they all owe us. One idealistic police chief isn't going to bring down an empire. Jake's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. So what's the plan? A slow smile spread across Calloway's face. We fight fire with fire. Chief Moore wants to play the hero. Let's see how she handles being the villain. For the next 20 minutes, Jake and Calloway huddled close, their voices low as they outlined their strategy. They would launch a coordinated media campaign, using their connections with local journalists to plant seeds of doubt about Lily's qualifications and intentions. We'll start with whispers, Calloway explained, anonymous sources expressing concern about her lack of experience. Then we'll escalate, hints of political favoritism in her appointment, suggestions that she's more interested in headlines than real police work. Jake nodded along, his confidence growing with each word. I know a few officers who aren't happy with the changes. We could get them to speak out, maybe leak some internal memos showing discord in the ranks. Calloway's eyes glinted with approval. Good thinking. And if we need to, we can always create some evidence to support our claims. A doctored email here, a conveniently misplaced report there. As their plan took shape, Jake felt a renewed sense of control. They would discredit Lily Moore before she could even get started, preserving the system that had served them so well for so long. The two men shook hands, their conspiracy sealed in the shadows of the parking garage. As Jake walked back to his car, a spring in his step, he failed to notice the small red light blinking on the security camera mounted in the corner. Calloway lingered for a moment, watching Jake's retreating figure. His phone buzzed with a text message. Meeting recorded. Proceed as discussed. A satisfied smirk played across his lips as he slid into his sedan and drove away, leaving the garage as silent and empty as it had been before their fateful encounter. Little did Jake and Calloway know, their carefully laid plans were about to collide with a force they never saw coming. The quiet determination of a young officer named Chris Meyer, armed with nothing but the truth and a burning desire for justice. The morning paper hit desks across Cedar View with a resounding thud. Its front page bore a headline that would send shockwaves through the police department and test Lily Moore's resolve like never before. Lily strode into the precinct, her usual confident gait slightly hesitant as she noticed the hushed conversations and furtive glances that followed her. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the cautious optimism that had permeated the station since her arrival. As she approached her office, Deputy Chief Thomas Wright intercepted her, his face etched with concern. "Chief, have you seen this?" He thrust the local newspaper into her hands, its bold headlines screaming accusations. New police chief's qualifications questioned, political appointment or genuine reform. Lily's eyes scanned the article, her expression darkening with each paragraph. Anonymous sources within the department claimed her appointment was a political move, suggesting she lacked the experience necessary for such a crucial role. The article hinted at backroom deals and questioned her ability to lead a department in need of significant reform. "This is ridiculous," Lily muttered, her grip on the paper tightening. She recognized the false claims for what they were, a calculated attack on her credibility. But as she reread the article, a nagging doubt crept in. Who were these anonymous sources? And more importantly, who stood to gain from undermining her before she'd even had a chance to implement real change? As Lily made her way through the station, she couldn't ignore the shift in the air. Officers who had been cautiously supportive now averted their gaze or whispered to each other as she passed. The seed of doubt had been planted, and she could almost feel it taking root. From his office, Jake Turner watched the scene unfold, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. He observed as Lily's shoulders tensed, noting the way her jaw clenched as she overheard snippets of conversation. His plan was working perfectly. Soon, the very officers who had applauded her calls for reform would be questioning her every move. Lily retreated to her office, closing the door behind her. She took a deep breath, centering herself as she had done countless times before. This was just the first salvo in what promised to be a long battle. She knew she couldn't let this go unanswered. With renewed determination, Lily picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. "Sarah, I need you to call an emergency meeting. All department heads and senior officers. 1 hour." As word of the meeting spread, the station buzzed with speculation. Officers gathered in small groups, debating what this could mean. Some wondered if Lily would address the allegations head-on, while others whispered that perhaps she was preparing to step down. At precisely 10 a.m., Lily stood before a packed conference room. She surveyed the faces before her, some concerned, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "By now, I'm sure you've all seen this morning's paper," Lily said, her voice steady and clear. "I want to address these allegations directly. My appointment as your chief was not a political favor. It was the result of years of hard work, dedication, and a proven track record of implementing successful reforms." She went on to outline her qualifications, her vision for the department, and her unwavering commitment to transparency. As she spoke, Lily could see the doubt in some officers' eyes begin to fade, replaced by a grudging respect. "I understand that change can be difficult," Lily concluded, "but I am here to work with each and every one of you to build a department we can all be proud of. My door is always open. If you have concerns, bring them to me. We're in this together." As the meeting adjourned, there was a palpable shift in the room. While not everyone was fully convinced, Lily's direct approach had gone a long way toward dispelling the rumors. She had weathered this first strike, but as she watched her officers file out, Lily knew this was just the beginning of a long and challenging fight. As the last echoes of Lily's impassioned speech faded, a new tension gripped the precinct. Officer Chris Meyer stood outside Lily's office, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The manila envelope in his hands felt impossibly heavy, laden with the weight of secrets that could tear the department apart. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come, and knocked on the door. Lily looked up from her desk, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the young officer. "Chris, come in," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "What can I do for you?" Chris hesitated for a moment before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He approached Lily's desk, his palms sweating as he placed the envelope before her. "Chief Moore, I have something you need to see." Lily's brow furrowed as she opened the envelope and began sifting through its contents. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock, then to a grim determination as she absorbed the gravity of what Chris had uncovered. Page after page of altered reports, suspicious patterns, and names that pointed to a web of corruption far more extensive than she had imagined. "How long have you been gathering this?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris swallowed hard. "A few days ever since your announcement about the reforms. I overheard some conversations that didn't sit right with me. The more I dug, the worse it got." Lily leaned back in her chair, her mind racing as she processed the implications of Chris's evidence. The challenge before her was monumental, far greater than anything she had anticipated when she took on this role. She looked up at Chris, noting the fear etched across his young face. "You understand the risks you're taking by bringing this to me, don't you?" Lily asked softly. Chris nodded, his voice shaky but resolute. "I do, Chief, but I couldn't stand by and watch everything you're trying to build get torn down before it even starts. I joined the force to make a difference, to do what's right, even if it means—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Lily stood up and walked around her desk, placing a reassuring hand on Chris's shoulder. "What you've done takes immense courage, Chris. I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to protect you. Your safety is my top priority." Relief washed over Chris's face, but the apprehension lingered in his eyes. "What happens now?" he asked. Lily returned to her seat, her mind already formulating a plan. "First, we need to verify everything in this file. Then, we'll need to move carefully. If this corruption runs as deep as it seems, we can't risk tipping our hand too soon." She pulled out a notepad and began jotting down names and dates. "I have some contacts outside the department, trusted investigators who can help us build a solid case. We'll need to be discreet, work in parallel with our regular duties to avoid raising suspicion." Chris leaned forward, his earlier fear giving way to a cautious determination. "What can I do to help?" Lily looked up, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Keep your eyes and ears open, but don't take any unnecessary risks. Report anything suspicious directly to me, no matter how small it might seem. We're in this together now, Chris." As Chris stood to leave, Lily added, "And Chris, thank you. What you've done today, it's the first real step towards the change we need." Chris nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over him as he left the office. He had set something monumental in motion, and there was no turning back now. As he returned to his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Unbeknownst to Lily and Chris, their actions had set off tremors throughout the department. Behind closed doors, Jake Turner called his inner circle together, his face a mask of barely contained panic. What lengths would these corrupt officers go to in order to protect their secrets? Jake paced the small conference room, his eyes darting nervously between the four officers seated around the table. The air was thick with tension as Jake ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Something's not right," he muttered, more to himself than the group. "Moore's been asking questions, poking around in places she shouldn't." Officer Reyes leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "What kind of questions?" Jake slammed his palm on the table, causing everyone to flinch. "Old case files, evidence logs, things that should be gathering dust. She's digging, and I don't like it." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Officer Chen was the first to speak, his voice low and cautious. "What do you suggest we do?" Jake's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "We need to step up our game. The newspaper article was a good start, but it's not enough. We need to hit more where it hurts. Her personal life." A collective murmur of unease rippled through the group. Officer Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That seems risky, Jake. If we get caught—" Jake rounded on him, his voice a low growl. "And what happens if we don't act? If Moore keeps digging, we'll all go down. Is that what you want, Dawson? The threat hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Jake looked at each officer in turn, reminding them without words of the leverage he held over them. Years of covered-up mistakes, falsified reports, and questionable decisions. Jake knew all their secrets. Officer Miller, the youngest of the group, spoke up hesitantly. What exactly did you have in mind? Jake's smile was cold as he outlined his plan. We start with rumors, carefully placed whispers about her personal life. Then we escalate. Anonymous tips about misconduct, maybe some doctored photos. By the time we're done, the community will be calling for her resignation. The room was silent as the officers processed Jake's words. The plan was ruthless, crossing lines they had never dared to before. But the alternative, exposure and disgrace, was unthinkable. One by one, they nodded their agreement, some more reluctantly than others. Jake's shoulders relaxed slightly as he saw their acquiescence. Good. We'll start implementing this immediately. I'll handle the media contacts. Chen, I want you to start compiling anything we can use against Moore. The rest of you, keep your ears to the ground. Any sign that she's on to us, I want to know immediately. As the meeting broke up, the officers filed out, their faces grim with the weight of what they had agreed to do. Officer Miller lingered behind, conflict etched across his young features. Jake noticed his hesitation and approached him, voice low and threatening. Having second thoughts, Miller? Miller swallowed hard, unable to meet Jake's eyes. It just seems wrong. Chief Moore hasn't done anything to deserve this. Jake's hand clamped down on Miller's shoulder, his fingers digging in painfully. Remember your place, rookie. You're in this as deep as the rest of us. Or have you forgotten about that little incident last month? How do you think your career would survive if that came to light? Miller paled, the fight draining out of him. He nodded once, defeated, and hurried out of the room. Jake watched him go, a mixture of satisfaction and contempt on his face. The storm was gathering, and he was determined to be the one left standing when it broke. Little did he know, the winds of change were already blowing, and the foundations of his corrupt empire were about to be shaken to their core. The clock on Lily's dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as she pulled into her driveway. Another grueling day of battling unseen enemies had left her drained, both mentally and physically. She longed for the solace of her home, a brief respite from the mounting pressures at the precinct. As she approached her front door, a flicker of movement caught her eye. The living room window was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible against the pale siding. Lily's heart rate quickened. She was certain she had locked everything before leaving that morning. Years of training kicked in as she drew her weapon, her exhaustion evaporating in an instant. With practiced caution, she eased the front door open, every sense on high alert. The interior of her home was shrouded in shadows, broken only by slivers of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Lily moved silently through the entryway, her back pressed against the wall. As she rounded the corner into the living room, she froze. The scene before her sent a chill down her spine. Her once tidy living room had been ransacked. Drawers hung open, their contents strewn across the floor. Couch cushions lay in disarray, slashed open as if searching for hidden treasures. Picture frames hung askew on the walls, their glass shattered. This was no random break-in. It was a message. Lily's gaze swept the room, assessing the damage and searching for any immediate threat. Finding none, she moved deeper into the house, clearing each room with meticulous precision. The kitchen, like the living room, bore signs of a thorough search. As she entered, something on the kitchen table caught her eye. A framed family photo, one that normally resided on her bedroom nightstand, sat in the center of the table. Lily approached cautiously, her weapon still at the ready. With trembling fingers, she turned the frame over. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the message scrawled across the back in red marker. Don't forget what you've left behind. The threat was clear. Whoever was behind this knew about her family, knew where she came from. They were telling her, in no uncertain terms, that her loved ones were not beyond their reach. Lily's hand tightened on her weapon as a mixture of fear and rage coursed through her. She retreated to the living room, her back against the wall as she dialed for backup. As she relayed the situation to dispatch, her mind raced. This invasion of her personal space, this threat against her family, was an escalation she hadn't anticipated. The fight had become deeply personal, crossing a line she never thought her opponents would dare to cross. As she waited for her fellow officers to arrive, Lily surveyed the chaos of her violated home. Each overturned piece of furniture, each shattered memento, served to strengthen her resolve. She had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but now the stakes were clearer than ever. This wasn't just about reforming a corrupt department anymore. It was about protecting everything and everyone she held dear. The distant wail of sirens broke through the night's stillness. Lily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She was more determined than ever to see this through, to root out the corruption that had infested her department like a cancer. As the flashing lights illuminated her driveway, Lily's jaw set in grim determination. They had made this personal, and now she would show them just how formidable an opponent she could be. Lily Moore's heart raced as she approached the precinct entrance. The angry chants from the crowd gathered outside reverberated through the building, a cacophony of discontent that had been building for days. Through the tinted windows, she could see a sea of protesters waving signs demanding her resignation. The smear campaign had worked its poison, turning public opinion against her before she'd had a chance to implement real change. Taking a deep breath, Lily straightened her uniform and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The chants intensified as she emerged, a wall of sound crashing over her. "Liar! Fraud! Resign now!" The insults cut through the air like knives, each one a reminder of the uphill battle she faced. Lily strode purposefully toward the hastily assembled podium, her eyes scanning the crowd. Anger twisted many faces, but she also caught glimpses of uncertainty, even curiosity. Not everyone was convinced by the lies spread about her. There was still hope. As she reached the microphone, a chorus of boos threatened to drown out her words before she could even speak. Lily raised her hands, silently imploring the crowd for a moment of their time. To her surprise, the noise began to ebb, replaced by an expectant hush. "Citizens of Cedar View," Lily began, her voice steady and clear, "I stand before you today not just as your police chief, but as a fellow member of this community. I've heard your concerns, your anger, and your fears. I understand them because I share them." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the hostility had lessened, replaced by wary attention. "Since my appointment, there have been allegations made about my qualifications and my character," Lily continued. "I want to address these head-on. Every decision I've made in my career has been guided by a commitment to justice and a desire to serve my community. I am here because I believe in the potential of Cedar View and its police department to be a model of integrity and accountability." As Lily spoke, she could see the shift in the crowd. Some still glared, unmoved, but others leaned forward, listening intently. She outlined her vision for the department: increased transparency, community engagement, and a zero-tolerance policy for corruption. "I know that trust is earned, not given," Lily said, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm asking for the chance to earn yours. My door is always open. I welcome your questions, your concerns, and your ideas. Together we can build a safer, more just Cedar View for everyone." As Lily finished speaking, a strange quiet fell over the crowd. The angry chants had died away, replaced by a thoughtful silence. Then from somewhere in the back, a single voice called out, "What about the evidence against you?" Lily didn't hesitate. "There is no evidence because there is no wrongdoing to hide. I invite anyone with concerns to bring them directly to me or to the independent review board we're establishing. Transparency isn't just a buzzword for me, it's a promise." Her words seemed to strike a chord. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious curiosity. As Lily stepped away from the podium, she could hear snippets of conversation, people debating what they'd heard. The crowd began to disperse, some still grumbling, others deep in discussion. Lily knew this was just the beginning. The smear campaign had done its damage, and rebuilding trust would take time. But as she watched the last of the protesters leave, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had planted seeds of doubt about the lies spread against her. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. Lily's moment of cautious optimism was shattered by a sudden, urgent knock. Chris burst into her office, his face ashen. What he discovered would force Lily to make the most critical decision of her career, one that could either save the department or destroy everything she'd worked for. "Chief, we have a problem," Chris gasped, struggling to catch his breath. He thrust a folder into Lily's hands, his fingers trembling. "I overheard Jake on the phone with Calloway. They're planning a massive cover-up operation." Lily's heart sank as she flipped through the documents. Detailed plans for destroying evidence, lists of potential witnesses to be silenced, and strategies for obstructing any investigation. The scale of the corruption was staggering, reaching far beyond what she had initially suspected. "How soon?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're moving fast," Chris replied, his eyes darting nervously to the door. "From what I gathered, they plan to start tonight. Once they destroy those files and get to those witnesses, we'll have nothing left to build a case on." Lily paced behind her desk, her mind racing. They had to act immediately, but moving too quickly could alert Jake and his allies, giving them time to cover their tracks even more thoroughly. On the other hand, waiting even a few hours could mean losing crucial evidence forever. "We can't risk waiting," Lily decided, her jaws set with determination. "But we need to be smart about this. If we tip our hand too soon, we could lose everything." Chris nodded, pulling out a small flash drive from his pocket. "I made copies of everything I could find. It's not much, but it's a start. If they manage to destroy the originals, at least we'll have something to work with." Lily felt a surge of pride for the young officer's foresight. "Good thinking, Chris. We'll need every scrap of evidence we can get our hands on." She leaned against her desk, formulating a plan. "We need to catch them off guard. A surprise internal audit, something that will give us access to the files they're planning to destroy without raising immediate suspicion." Chris's eyes widened. "An audit? Won't that tip them off?" "It might," Lily admitted, "but it's our best shot at preserving the evidence legally. If we move fast enough, we can secure the most crucial documents before they have a chance to react." She picked up her phone, dialing a number with steady fingers. "Sarah, I need you to put together an audit team immediately. Tell them it's a routine check, but stress the importance of discretion. And Chris," she added, turning to the young officer, "I want you on that team. You know what we're looking for." As Chris left to join the hastily assembled audit team, Lily could feel the tension in the air thicken. Word of the surprise audit spread through the station like wildfire, sending ripples of fear and anticipation through the ranks. She caught glimpses of officers whispering in corners, their eyes darting nervously as the audit team made its way through the building. Lily knew she had just lit the fuse on a powder keg. The next few hours would determine whether her efforts to clean up the department would succeed or go up in flames. As she watched the audit team disappear into the records room, Lily steeled herself for the battle ahead. The tipping point had arrived, and there was no turning back now. Jake Turner paced his office like a caged animal, beads of sweat forming on his brow as the audit team combed through records just outside his door. The sound of shuffling papers and hushed conversations filtered through, each question about discrepancies sending a jolt of panic through his body. He glanced at his phone, willing it to ring with news of a miracle that could save him from this nightmare. As the hours ticked by, Jake noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Officers who had once eagerly followed his lead now averted their eyes as they passed his office. The loyalty he had cultivated through years of favors and threats was evaporating in the face of potential exposure. Jake's stomach churned as he realized his carefully constructed network of allies was unraveling, thread by thread. His phone buzzed, Calloway's name flashing on the screen. Jake answered with trembling hands, bracing himself for the fury on the other end. Calloway's voice was low and dangerous as he demanded answers, berating Jake for letting the situation spiral so far out of control. Jake stammered excuses, but even to his own ears, they sounded hollow and desperate. Determined to salvage what he could, Jake ventured out into the station. He approached a group of officers, plastering on a confident smile that felt more like a grimace. But as he drew near, the conversation died, replaced by uncomfortable glances and mumbled excuses to be elsewhere. Jake watched in disbelief as some of his most trusted allies walked straight into the audit room, clearly ready to cooperate with the investigation. As the reality of his situation sank in, Jake retreated to his office, locking the door behind him. He stared at his reflection in the window, barely recognizing the desperate man looking back at him. In that moment, Jake realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling, and a dangerous thought began to take root in his mind. Perhaps there was one last, drastic measure he could take to save himself from the impending ruin. The first rays of dawn crept through the station windows as Jake Turner entered, his eyes wild and unfocused. Gone was the confident swagger that had defined him for years. In its place was a man driven to desperation, clinging to his last shred of hope for survival. Jake moved with purpose, his steps quick and determined as he made his way towards the evidence room. As he rounded the corner, Jake came face to face with Chris Meyer. The young officer stood firm, his body blocking the entrance to the room that held Jake's potential salvation, or his ultimate downfall. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the air thick with tension. "Step aside, Meyer," Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. "This doesn't concern you." Chris stood his ground, his resolve evident in his steady gaze. "I can't let you do this, Jake. It's over." Jake's fragile control snapped. With a roar of frustration, he lunged at Chris, his larger frame propelling them both backwards. They crashed into the wall, grappling for control. Jake's desperation lent him a frenzied strength, his fists connecting with Chris's jaw and ribs. Chris fought back, his training kicking in as he deflected blows and attempted to subdue the older officer. But Jake was beyond reason, beyond fear of consequences. He fought like a cornered animal, all technique abandoned in favor of raw, desperate force. The commotion drew attention. Officers from nearby desks rushed to the scene, their shouts adding to the chaos. Hands reached out, trying to pull Jake away, but he shrugged them off, his focus solely on getting past Chris and into that evidence room. Suddenly, Jake broke free from the tangle of bodies. He stumbled back, chest heaving, and reached for his weapon. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged cut through the noise like a knife. Everyone froze, the air electric with fear and disbelief. "Back off!" Jake shouted, his gun wavering as he swept it across the group of officers. "All of you, just back the hell off." The standoff stretched on, seconds feeling like hours. Jake's eyes darted frantically between the faces of his former colleagues, seeing shock, fear, and in some cases pity. The realization of how far he had fallen hit him like a physical blow. "Jake." The calm, steady voice cut through the tension. Lily Moore approached slowly, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. Her gaze never left Jake's face as she spoke. "It's over, Jake. You know that. This isn't going to change anything." Jake's hand trembled, the gun dipping slightly. "You don't understand. I can't let it end like this." Lily took another step closer. "I do understand, but this isn't the way. Think about what you're doing. Is this really how you want to be remembered?" The words seemed to penetrate the fog of panic and desperation that had consumed Jake. He looked at the gun in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered the weapon. I don't." Jake's voice broke, the fight draining out of him. Lily nodded to the officers behind her. They moved in swiftly, disarming Jake and securing his hands behind his back. As they led him away, Jake's shoulders sagged in defeat. The last vestiges of his power and influence disappeared, leaving behind a man who had lost everything in his desperate attempt to hold on to control. The flash of cameras illuminated the packed press room as Lily Moore stepped up to the podium. Her face was a mask of determination, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. The room buzzed with anticipation, reporters leaning forward in their seats, pens poised over notepads. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the full revelation of the corruption that had plagued the Cedar View Police Department for years. Lily took a deep breath, her hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I've called this press conference to address the recent events within our police department and to share with you the findings of our internal investigation." The room fell silent as Lily carefully outlined the years-long web of misconduct that had been uncovered. She spoke of falsified reports, evidence tampering, and a network of favors that had allowed corrupt officers to operate with impunity. As she named key players, including Jake Turner and Mark Calloway. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Former officer Jake Turner and Deputy Mayor Mark Calloway were at the center of this corruption, Lily explained, her voice tinged with a mix of disappointment and resolve. They used their positions of authority to manipulate the system, protect their allies, and silence those who threatened to expose them. The journalist listened in stunned silence as Lily detailed the extent of Jake and Calloway's involvement. She spoke of bribes, blackmail, and a systematic effort to undermine any attempts at reform. The scale of the corruption was staggering, reaching far beyond what many had imagined. As Lily finished her initial statement, the room erupted with questions. Reporters called out, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of demands for more information. Lily raised her hand, calling for order, and began addressing the queries one by one. Chief Moore, how deep does this corruption go? A reporter from the Cedar View Gazette asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. Lily met his gaze steadily. Our investigation has revealed that this corruption touched nearly every level of our department. However, I want to stress that many officers were unaware of the full extent of these activities. Some were coerced or manipulated into silence. Another journalist stood, her voice sharp with skepticism. How can the public trust that you'll be able to clean up this mess? Weren't you in charge when all of this was happening? Lily nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. I understand your concern. While it's true that some of these activities occurred after my appointment, the roots of this corruption go back years. From the moment I suspected something was amiss, I've been working tirelessly to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. As the questions continued, Lily maintained her composure. She answered each query with transparency and resolve, refusing to shy away from the hard truths that needed to be addressed. The atmosphere in the room gradually shifted from shock and skepticism to a cautious respect for Lily's honesty and determination. Finally, Lily raised her hand, signaling that she had one last statement to make. In light of these revelations, I am announcing a series of sweeping reforms for the Cedar View Police Department, she declared. These will include increased transparency measures, mandatory ethics training, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee comprised of community members. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the room. Lily continued, her voice filled with conviction. I am also extending an open invitation to the community to participate in this process of reform. Your input and oversight will be crucial as we work to rebuild trust and create a police department that truly serves and protects all members of our community. As the press conference drew to a close, the room was filled with a mix of emotions. Shock at the extent of the revelations mingled with a cautious optimism for the changes to come. Lily stepped away from the podium, her shoulders straight and her gaze unwavering. She had taken the first step towards transparency and accountability. Now the real work of rebuilding trust and reforming the department could begin. As news of the Cedar View police corruption scandal spread across the nation, it ignited a firestorm of conversations about law enforcement reform. Police departments from coast to coast found themselves under intensified scrutiny, with citizens demanding transparency and accountability. In the wake of Lily Moore's revelations, many agencies began conducting internal reviews, fearful of similar issues lurking within their own ranks. Lily's phone rang incessantly with invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences and consult on reform efforts. Her inbox overflowed with messages from police chiefs and community leaders seeking her guidance. The sudden attention was overwhelming, and Lily often found herself staring at the ceiling late at night, mind racing with the weight of expectations placed upon her. Despite the clamor for her insights, Lily remained steadfastly focused on the ongoing changes within her own department. She knew that true reform began at home, and Cedar View still had a long way to go. Each morning, she arrived at the precinct before dawn, determined to lead by example and rebuild trust from the ground up. The community watched with cautious optimism as Lily implemented a series of new training programs and accountability measures. She established a civilian oversight committee, giving local residents a voice in departmental policies. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers on duty, and Lily instituted a rigorous review process for use of force incidents. Officer Chris Meyer, who had played a crucial role in exposing the corruption, found himself at the forefront of these changes. Lilly tapped him to lead a new ethics training program for both veteran officers and new recruits. Chris embraced the role with enthusiasm, drawing on his own experiences to illustrate the importance of moral courage in law enforcement. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere within the Cedarview Police Department began to shift. Officers who had initially resisted the changes started to see the benefits of increased transparency and community engagement. Complaints against the department decreased, while positive interactions with citizens rose steadily. 6 months after the scandal broke, an independent audit revealed significant improvements in departmental culture and practices. The report highlighted a marked increase in officer morale and a renewed sense of purpose among the rank and file. Community leaders expressed cautious optimism about the changes, noting improved response times and a more visible police presence in neighborhoods that had long felt neglected. Lily sat in her office late one evening, poring over the audit results. She felt a mix of pride and humility as she reflected on the progress made. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time since taking on the role of police chief, Lily allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. As she prepared to leave for the night, Lily's gaze fell on a framed photo on her desk. It showed her standing with a group of community leaders at a recent town hall meeting. The smiles on their faces were tentative but genuine, a far cry from the hostility she had faced just months earlier. Lily touched the frame lightly, a reminder of why she had taken on this monumental task in the first place. With renewed determination, Lily gathered her things and headed out. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready to face them head on. The ripple effect of change was spreading, and Lily Moore was determined to see it through one day at a time. The ripple effect of change was indeed spreading, but its next wave would come from an unexpected source. As the sun rose on a new day in Cedarview, a group of fresh-faced recruits filed into the police academy, unaware they were about to receive a lesson that would challenge everything they thought they knew about law enforcement. Officer Chris Meyer stood at the front of the classroom, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He took a deep breath, acutely aware of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Chief Moore had personally tasked him with teaching the department's new ethics and accountability course, a cornerstone of her sweeping reforms. As the last recruit took their seat, Chris cleared his throat. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "I'm Officer Meyer, and today we're going to talk about something that's not in your standard textbooks: moral courage in law enforcement." The recruits straightened in their seats, pens poised over notebooks. Chris could see a mix of curiosity and skepticism in their eyes. He knew that look well. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. "6 months ago, I was sitting where you are now," Chris continued, pacing slowly in front of the whiteboard. "I thought I knew what it meant to be a good cop. Follow orders, protect your fellow officers, keep your head down." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I was wrong." Chris recounted his journey from silent witness to active change agent. He spoke of the corruption he'd observed, the internal struggle he'd faced, and the moment he decided to take a stand. As he described the risks he'd taken to expose the truth, he noticed several recruits shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I know what you're thinking," Chris said, his voice softening. "You're wondering if you'd have the courage to do the same, to risk your career, your friendships, maybe even your safety for what's right." He looked each recruit in the eye. "That's what we're here to talk about today." For the next hour, Chris led a frank discussion about the ethical challenges officers face daily. He presented real-world scenarios, encouraging the recruits to grapple with difficult decisions. Throughout the session, he emphasized one crucial point: the badge they would soon wear was a symbol of public trust, not a shield from accountability. As the class neared its end, Chris noticed a change in the room. The initial skepticism had given way to thoughtful engagement. Even the recruits who had seemed most resistant were now leaning forward, fully invested in the conversation. "Before we wrap up," Chris said, "I have someone I'd like you to meet." He gestured toward the door, where Chief Lily Moore had been quietly observing the session. Lily stepped forward, her presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "Thank you, Officer Meyer," she said, offering Chris a small smile before turning to address the recruits. "What you've learned today is the foundation of everything we're trying to build in Cedarview." Lily began. Her voice was firm but tinged with passion as she outlined her vision for a department built on integrity and trust. She spoke of the challenges they would face, the resistance they might encounter, but also of the profound difference they could make in their community. As Lily concluded her remarks, Chris could see the impact of her words reflected in the faces of the recruits. There was a new energy in the room, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The recruits filed out, engaged in animated discussions about what they'd learned. Chris overheard snippets of conversation, commitments to hold each other accountable, questions about community engagement initiatives, ideas for building trust with citizens. As the last recruit left the room, Chris turned to Lily. They exchanged a silent nod, both recognizing the significance of what had transpired. It was a small step, but an important one on the long road to lasting change. The setting sun painted Cedarview in hues of orange and gold as Police Chief Lily Moore stood by her office window, lost in thought. A year had passed since she'd first walked through the precinct doors, determined to root out corruption and restore integrity to the department. The journey had been tumultuous, filled with unexpected challenges and hard-won victories. Lily's gaze swept over the city skyline, taking in the familiar landmarks that now held new meaning. The courthouse where she'd testified against Jake Turner and his co-conspirators. The community center where she'd held countless town halls, rebuilding trust with skeptical residents. The park where officers now regularly engaged in friendly pickup games with local youth. She turned back to her desk, picking up a stack of reports. The numbers were encouraging. Complaints against officers down by 30%, community satisfaction up by 25%, and a marked decrease in use of force incidents. Yet Lily knew these statistics told only part of the story. True reform was a slow, often painful process that required constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. As she flipped through the pages, Lily's mind wandered to the resistance she still faced within the department. While many officers had embraced the changes, there were those who clung to the old ways, viewing her reforms as a threat to their authority. Just last week, she'd overheard two veteran detectives grumbling about the new oversight measures, dismissing them as political correctness gone mad. Lily sighed, setting the reports aside. She walked to a small framed photo on her bookshelf, tracing her finger along the image of her grandmother, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes. The memory of her words echoed in Lily's mind. Justice isn't a destination, child. It's a path you walk every day of your life. Those words had sustained Lily through the darkest moments of the past year, when the smear campaign against her had reached its peak, when Jake Turner had held a gun to her head, when she'd faced a hostile crowd of protesters demanding her resignation. Now they served as a reminder that her work was far from over. With renewed determination, Lily returned to her desk. She pulled out a fresh notepad and began jotting down ideas for the next phase of reforms. Expanded mental health resources for officers, a youth mentorship program to build stronger community ties, advanced de-escalation training for the entire force. As night fell over Cedarview, the lights of the police station remained on, a beacon of ongoing change. Lily glanced at the clock. 9:45 p.m. She should head home, get some rest before another challenging day. But the work called to her, as it always did. Lily reached for her phone, dialing a familiar number. Chris? It's Chief Moore. I've got some ideas I want to run by you for our next community outreach initiative. Do you have a minute? As she spoke with her trusted lieutenant, Lily felt a familiar mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The road ahead was long and fraught with obstacles, but she was more committed than ever to seeing it through. One day at a time, one small victory after another, they would build the department Cedarview deserved, a force truly dedicated to serving and protecting all its citizens. Lily Moore's journey from an outsider to a reformer stands as a testament to the power of unwavering integrity in the face of deeply rooted corruption. Her determination to expose the truth and implement meaningful changes transformed the Cedarview Police Department, offering a beacon of hope that positive change is possible even in the most entrenched systems. The story of Cedarview challenges us to examine our own roles in upholding justice within our communities. It reminds us that speaking truth to power, while often difficult and fraught with personal risk, is essential for creating a more just society. Lily's struggle against corruption, her resilience in the face of threats and smear campaigns, and her ultimate triumph serve as an inspiration for those who seek to make a difference. As we reflect on Lily's journey, we are called to consider how we can contribute to positive change in our own spheres of influence. Whether it's standing up against injustice in the workplace, advocating for transparency in local government, or simply refusing to turn a blind eye to wrongdoing, each of us has the power to be an agent of change. The transformation of Cedarview demonstrates that with courage, persistence, and a commitment to what's right, even the most deeply rooted problems can be addressed and overcome.